Ladies, gentlemen, and exiles of all ages, Path of Exile 2 has been out in early access for nearly a week now, and while some of us are still progressing through the campaign, some people are doing it for the second time on Cruel, and others are pushing properly deep into the actual endgame, the proper blasters. As people progress through the game and hit various levels of challenge along the way, you may be wondering what the struggle is for in the end. In a way, what you could be doing in the endgame once you actually get past all the hardships of the early game, and once you have everything that you could possibly desire. The potential of what your ascendancy is, and while it is still early days, of course, there is plenty to be discovered or popularized. I just wanted to put together a list of some particularly strong but also cool looking builds that I've seen for each ascendancy in my own opinion. Talk a little bit about how they function and what makes them unique or just strong in general, and of course the original creator will have their channel on the screen so you can go check them out if you want to see any of these full builds with complete details or ask questions of the person who knows it the best. And also a note that we will be sharing our own endgame builds once we actually reach that stage of the game too, for anyone interested in seeing those as well. One final note before we begin then, just last night there was a major patch for the game that basically destroyed all trigger skill based builds, meaning things like cast on ignite, cast on shock, cast on freeze, cast on crit, all those types of culprits. They changed the way that energy gain works entirely for these skills, and so now they are just triggering maybe a tenth as often in some cases, at least for the random tiny mobs. They made it scale off of enemy power. It is closer against things like bosses still, which does make the build still somewhat functional, but for the most part, anything that would have been on this list yesterday that used these skills as the main part of their damage setup has now been nerfed so hard that it doesn't belong here anymore. A great example being the relatively commonly used cast on ignite, creating comets to strike from above, and using piddly little flame wall to actually cause the ignites to begin with, because the energy gained towards the skill trigger was not negatively affected by the ignites from flame wall being such low damage. Now, however, they are affected by this, and they just don't at all function the same anymore. This build is way worse. That said, first up then, let's talk about the warrior, and Titan first off is by far the more popular of the ascendancies, with the build that I want to highlight being Hammer of the Gods Ignites Titan. The main point of this setup is taking Hammer of the Gods, a 24-second cooldown skill that does incredibly high damage, and one mana left, the creator, paired this with Ignites as a concept as the main sort of synergy here. Ignites scale their damage over time based on the initial hit that applies them, and so applying an Ignite with Hammer of the Gods allows you to essentially multiply the damage of the skill by hitting with it multiple times in a row in that way because of the way that burn works. It doesn't necessarily reapply all the damage, but the burn that it applies is based off of the damage of the initial hit. It hits incredibly hard, so change it to fire damage, and now it burns incredibly hard after that hit as well. Build around fire damage and Ignite then, using the Avatar of Fire passive tree node to convert damage to fire to begin with, building around Ignite duration to increase the actual sustain of the super high damage from this, and make it one-shot even higher tier map bosses. Then boosting this specific interaction through things like the Fist of War support for a buff that applies to a skill once every few seconds, Eternal Flame support gem for double the duration of the Ignite itself, essentially doubling the damage of this effect, and the Infernal Cry skill, which boosts skills used afterwards, paired with the Enraged Warcry support gem to further boost the Hammer of the Gods damage while this buff is active. Basically, the whole goal of this build and this setup is to reach an obscene level of tankiness through life regeneration. Bring large groups of enemies together, or find a tanky rare enemy or walk up to a boss, press your buff buttons, press Hammer of the Gods, and then watch everything melt around you. Combine this with the Ascendancy node Earthbreaker for 20% chance to cause aftershocks with slam skills, which does count for Hammer of the Gods. You stack Ignite duration, and then you've just got a build where you freely walk between enemies looking for things that you actually care about killing. Press a couple of buttons, and then they die there, even in the deep endgame. Next up then we have the Warbringer Ascendancy, and the coolest and strongest looking thing that I've seen so far for this is the Armor Break focused Warbringer with your auto attack, your basic skill. Armor Break is a mechanic available to pretty much everyone, but Warbringer takes advantage of it especially due to a couple of specific ascendancy nodes. Anvil's Weight makes you break armor equal to 10% of hit damage dealt, Imploding Impacts lets you break enemy armor below 0, and this combo, especially in endgame gear, can let you really achieve some very silly things, even just with your basic attack skill, as this is a one-handed mace auto attack build, at least until you can actually use the Giant's Blood Keystone passive to let you wield a two-handed weapon in one hand, and then you use your auto attack with the mace to just both apply and pop Armor Break itself. It can set things to literally 5 digits of negative armor stacks, which is actually ridiculous, and then you can pop that for a massive amount of bonus damage through your auto attack with the Armor Explosion support gem inside of it, which then causes an explosion of fire damage around an enemy when you fully break their armor. The way the game calculates these things, they can apply with the same singular hit, letting you apply Armor Break and consume it to explode within one attack, increasing the damage dramatically and leading to the fun combo that you see here. Honestly, it's a relatively relatively simple concept to play, but a really lovely pile of synergies of skills, passives, and supports to make it really stand up. But it looks both effective and quite fun to play. Moving on to the next class, then we've got the sorceress, and the generally more popular ascendancy within this is the Stormweaver. The build that has the best potential that I've seen here are just sort of general Archmage based setups. Archmage is a level 14 spirit skill that makes any non-channeling spells cost additional mana but deal significantly increased lightning damage based on your maximum mana. So the idea is this is sort of the ultimate long-term lightning build fueler, using the pure power of Archmage itself through skills like Shock or Arc, and then mixing in Orb of Storms for some bonus procs of lightning damage as well, and then you solve your survivability through the Chaos Inoculation passive, which makes you immune to chaos damage but sets your maximum life to 1, and the Mind Over Matter passive, which makes all damage be taken from mana before life. Then you pick up a ton of mana management modifiers or uniques, including this belt here, which makes 50% of damage taken recoup as mana. With damage just being taken from mana first, you essentially use this to gain 50% less damage taken in general. And then there's also the Everlasting Gaze Amulet, which gives you tons of just mana regen as well as a percentage of maximum mana as bonus maximum energy shield. Then offensively, your main important node is Pure Power up at the top of the passive tree, which is just an infinite scaling potential node. It increases your lightning damage in proportion to your intelligence stat, so the better your gear gets, the more intelligence you can stack up with this and the more damage you will do. Combine that with Arcane Surge from the Ascendancy tree for bonus mana regen and cast speed, and then Force of Will, which increases the effect of Arcane Surge per 15 maximum mana, and the clear synergies here are born and they're made quite obvious too. Lightning damage, intelligence stacking, and mana-based modifiers all contributing massively to turn you into just a pure lightning killing machine. Following that, then we have the other sorceress ascendancy, which is Chronomancer. The most interesting thing that I've seen sort of popping up at the endgame for this is using a skill that's familiar from a previous build already on the list, Hammer of the Gods. As mentioned earlier, this skill is super high damage with a very high cooldown, at least as far as this game's general cooldown cycles. The Titan manages this in using this skill by just making the most out of that single use per cooldown with ignites, whereas the Chronomancer sort of does the reverse. It takes advantage of the high damage of the attack and instead lowers the cooldowns by using its general cooldown reductions, but also time snap to reset the cooldown of the ability and let you use it even more often. Combine this with Leap Slam for mobility and stun application, Bone Shatter with the Impact Shockwave support gem for aftershocks, Exploit Weakness to consume armor breaks, and then Magnified Effect for a larger area of effect too, and then use this to actually cause the heavy stuns and consume the armor breaks. Then, whenever you need to have a little bit more actual damage going down, you use Hammer of the Gods for the big smackdown when it's time for more larger, meaningful enemies like hefty rare enemies or against bosses, of course. And then with the cooldown reset, you can just sort of do it all over again like it's no problem. Other than that, you just sort of build damage to heavy stunned enemies to actually benefit the fact that you can heavy stun. You build around rage for some relatively strong buffs you can add on top, especially to attack speed, letting it all sort of work together better. You put some power into your auto attack Mace Strike as well, and then in your ascendancy, the ultra important nodes are Now and Again for a chance to not consume the cooldown on Hammer of the Gods to begin with, and then of course Unbound Encore to grant time snap for the cooldown reset. And when everything lines up to you with good RNG, you get to do Hammer of the Gods 4 times in a row, essentially with barely any downtime. After that, then let's talk about the mercenary, starting with the generally more popular Witchhunter ascendancy. This is the simpler of the two ascendancies, but not in a bad way, and the best looking builds for this one so far are pretty undeniably all based around grenade skills in general. A lot of them specifically around gas grenades and then triggering these into explosions with fire skills or auto ignites, massive AoE potential through this concept, just chugging out grenades everywhere and then blowing them up around you. This has even already been nerfed by GGG due to the interactions that people found with Flame Wall with this, basically just auto-popping grenades way quicker than they wanted, but this is still the strongest general setup and concept for the class right now, regardless of that. The general pairings with this to make it particularly effective are multi-shot flash grenades for ridiculous stun buildup, oil grenades which apply fire exposure and make enemies weaker to fire damage, as well as creating an oiled grenade ground effect as well to keep applying this effect afterwards. Then just using loads and loads of gas grenades with some method of auto-igniting them, the two most popular of these for these builds that I've seen being the Radiant Grief unique helmet, which applies ignites near you automatically, or the Birth of Fury unique boots, which creates an ignited ground effect while moving, which also pops the gas grenades. This then just mixes well with Witchhunter's generally strong kit, devastating blows to open the fight for a lot of bonus damage, culling blows to end the fight very early with executes, and then the whole concentration system, which just makes it easier to survive while you're doing your thing and applying your massive amounts of damage. Then we have the other ascendants too for this class, Gemling Legionnaire. For all intents and purposes, this is just a ridiculous pure endgame scaling ascendancy, and funny enough, the coolest build build for Gemling Legionnaire is extremely similar conceptually to the best one for Witchhunter, using gas grenades and triggering their detonations into massive explosions, except that Gemling Legionnaire has some very specific late tier advantages, like allowing the same support gem to be used in multiple skill gems simultaneously, which opens up a whole bunch of just ridiculous bonus synergies that you can do with this. And I won't spend an overly long time on this build because for all intents and purposes, it is just the same concept as a Witchhunter build. It just takes a lot longer to get online because of how the Gemling Legionnaire functions in itself, with extra skill slots, extra uses of the same support gem, and things like that. And this also makes you sort of remove the auto ignite because the gear is much more important to have, and having rares gives you a lot more bonuses. This does make it more complex to actually use this build on the Gemling Legionnaire, so you don't run a unique alongside it, and instead you pop gas grenades manually with explosive grenade. And then the extra skill slots just allow you to run a bunch of extra generally useful things like Enfeeble as a curse for damage reduction, or Leap Slam for stuns and mobility, or even just Voltaic Grenade for electrocution buildup and another type of lockdown added in as a result. Next up we have the Monk, with the more popular ascendancy by a good margin being the Invoker, the big elemental master blaster. This one was hit particularly hard by the trigger skill nerfs in the patch last night, as it is just natural intended synergies with trigger skills in general, so of course people were building around them. It's to the point that it has shifted what I would call the coolest powerful build for the ascendancy. Beforehand in endgame it was looking like cast on crit, creating comets through Eye of Winter, but in that setup you required the trigger skill for literally all of your actual damage. The way things work right now, trigger skills are still pretty solid against bosses, and for everything else they are just far less reliable. So instead, the build that I want to talk about today now is semi-melee Lightning Invoker, which still utilizes a trigger skill in cast on shock, proccing comet for high damage, but mostly this is only relied upon as a bonus boss damage. The rest of it funnels heavily through Tempest Flurry for burst damage in melee range, Stormwave for longer range, safer damage output, and importantly, Charged Staff. This uses power charges to apply a lasting duration buff that adds lightning damage projectiles to all of your other attacks, and it's basically just free bonus damage on top of everything else. It triggers more shock procs, it does a bunch of bonus damage, and it adds range to Tempest Flurry essentially as well. As for how to generate the power charges to keep this active, that's where we get a bit of a fun interaction, which is the Combat Frenzy level 8 spirit skill from the Ranger section, which gives you a frenzy charge every time you freeze, pin, or electrocute an enemy, and then pairing that with the Resonance passive in the skill tree, which changes all frenzy charges into power charges automatically. You then put the electrocute gem in one of your main skills, and you get an automatic source of power charge generation for massive uptime on Charged Staff. Or if you can get it, there's the Kitoko's Current Gloves, which makes lightning damage from all hits contribute to electrocution buildup, not only fueling the power charges in general, but just making electrocution as an ailment much more common and usable. And this is essentially elemental heavy stun when it goes off, so having this as a thing that you can just regularly apply will make your gameplay much safer and more comfortable as a whole. Nothing is less dangerous than an enemy who cannot fight back. Then we have the other monk ascendancy, the Acolyte of Chayula. There are far less people playing this choice for the class, so the pickings are a little bit slimmer, sure, but the generally most interesting build I've seen is again not actually using a quarterstaff, but taking advantage of the Acolyte of Chayula's ascendancy nodes that grant buffs around chaos damage and the buffs for the flames in general. You then pick up all the flames for buffs to your general damage just during gameplay. You use Combat Frenzy, a level 8 Ranger Spirit skill that gives you frenzy charges when you freeze, electrocute, or pin enemies, and then you mix this with Rain of Arrows as a bow skill with pin as a support gem to make the skill's physical damage apply pin. Rain of Arrows costs frenzy charges to use and pins enemies when it does damage. Combat Frenzy generates frenzy charges when you pin enemies, which just creates a really solid, simple foundation of a gameplay loop to build all the other effects on top of, such as poison, which this player has done a lot of. Other options that I've seen is people using the Resonance keystone in the passive tree to instead turn the frenzy charges into power charges when you get them, then using Flicker Step as a monk skill as a method of spending these power charges, and working electrocute or freeze into the setup in general to create your proper infinite charge builds. Moving on, next up then is the Ranger. First up with the Deadeye Ascendancy, the most interesting build I've seen is actually one that was hit by the nerfs last night, but while it definitely has gone down a peg, it went from absolutely busted to just really good still, which is Lightning Rod Deadeye that does in fact make use of Cast on Shock, but in a somewhat different way. Lightning Rod is a skill that sticks an arrow in the ground, and whenever a chain lightning effect chains to it, it does a large pulse of damage in an area around it. If you then hit the lightning rods with lightning arrows, they basically multiply your damage by pulsing this to anything around them as well, and then with all the lightning damage, you're highly likely to proc Shock Ailment. So Cast on Shock is a natural pairing for this, and then sticking Ball Lightning in there fires off a ton of bonus chain lightnings to bounce off of the lightning rods to apply even more damage. Cast on Shock was nerfed, but the end result of this is that this build is just still very nasty against bosses, where the energy generation for the trigger skill is still reasonable, but you just won't create ball lightnings very often while doing general map clearing of smaller enemies. That said, the general combo of scattershot lightning rod from multiple sources of the actual echoing pulses firing multiple projectiles when you do it, and then lightning arrow alongside it can do just a crazy amount of damage with that synergy by itself, and the other skills essentially just existing to support this concept. This gets boosted further through the ascendancy tree by things like the node that gives Deadeye a bonus projectile for all projectile-based skills, giving you more rods for your effect to actually chain to, and then also more lightning arrows fired per lightning arrow. Then there's also the tailwind mechanic in the ascendancy tree too for enhanced skill speed and movement speed too, and even damage reduction if you take that node as well. Then the general combat is lightning rods fire lightning arrows as an active source of applying shock and chaining to lightning rod, and then the shocks will eventually create the ball lightning to trigger more lightning rods, and that's essentially the gist of the whole thing. The other ascendancy for this class then is the Pathfinder. This one is pretty criminally underrepresented among players as far as I'm concerned, but it is doing quite well in its main specific niche, which is poison, and then poison. Specifically the ascendancy nodes that make your strongest poison spread, and the node that doubles the number of poisons that targets can be affected by, and then just mixing and matching these with the toxic growth skill to create a bunch of pustules to exist on the ground which explode, creating even more violent explosions if they have been poisoned. Then mix that with gas arrow for general poison application, plague bearer as a spirit skill to give you burst damage based off the poison damage you do, vine arrow to sort of just manage the larger packs of enemies quite easily, applying lots of slow and doing more damage itself if you apply poison to the vines. You stick the corrosion support gem on gas arrow to make it actively melt away enemy armor if they're in the gas, giving them the armor break debuff, and then armor explosion as a support gem as well in the same skill to make it cause a fire explosion when you break an enemy's armor, which then essentially allows gas arrow to create its own explosions as a result, combusting upon itself and leaving the rest to just be ways to increase your damage around that main sort of output synergy, and everything else just sort of works to either boost you or be utility or crowd control against your enemies. Then for our final class today, we have the Witch, starting with the Infernalist ascendancy. This actually saw a nerf recently, but until it's fixed further, it's sort of hard not to talk about Grim Feast and Skeleton Arsonist with SRS or Raging Spirits and Flame Wall. The long and short of it is Flame Wall is used to summon Raging Spirits for loads of potential damage from a fire melee minion. Up until a couple of days ago, this was paired with Cast on Minion Death to turn it into an auto build and have the deaths of these Raging Spirits trigger the Arsonist's actual detonations. But since the recent hotfix to how these functions interact, it's no longer automatic. You have to trigger the detonations yourself, but the damage is still very meaty from the look of it. This also breaks much further with the Grim Feast spirit skill that gives energy shield per death of regenerating minion. This is definitely not working as intended. It is triggering from Arsonist deaths, which it should be, but it's very bugged right now, triggering from just a bunch of other things happening. I'm not showing footage of someone abusing this bug, but put simply, when abused, this can give you like over 10,000 energy shields, which obviously makes you pretty much immortal, but I don't want to tell people to go and try that out because, well, it's clearly a bug. It will be fixed. GGG has been very much on top of things and fixing them, and when it does get fixed, if you built into it and leaned into it, you'll be absolutely devastated. But outside of that, the general goal of this sort of setup is to just build loads and loads of bonus maximum life, then take the ascendancy node that gives you bonus spirit per maximum life, and just use that to scale up your minions. Your arsonists do bonus damage, shooting through the flame wall that you used to summon the raging spirits in the first place, and so it all just funnels together beautifully into a fire minion build. Then our final build of the day would be for the Blood Mage Ascendancy, but this Ascendancy is having some pretty major problems right now where the actual scaling of Sanguimancy, the second node into their Ascendancy track that you have to take if you want to take anything else, makes it so that your spells take life as well as mana when you cast them. There's supposed to be inherent leech within this Ascendancy tree too to offset this, but the leech itself seems bugged right now according to a number of different players, and so the result is if you have the Sanguimancy node, you just sort of do a ton of damage to yourself, especially as you move further into endgame where mana costs run quite high on spells. Because the life cost scales with the mana cost, you end up in a really tough situation where you're just damaging yourself, and you do not have the actual survivability to overcome it. All in all, there aren't really Blood Mage specific builds yet because of this. Blood Mages have just sort of been doing the best they can without building into their Ascendancy points, using the best sort of neutral class builds. Things like the Cast on Ignite Comet build that I mentioned earlier was a great example until it was nerfed last night, so sorry Blood Mage, you are in some need of some serious fixes right now for sure. That just about that does it for today, and everyone, just a sort of roundup of some of the cool builds and powerful things that I've seen running around the community for each ascendancy to give you a sort of glimpse into your potential future. A look at some of the things being done in proper endgame ahead of where the majority of the player base is with their progress. Of course, these aren't necessarily the be-all, end-all of builds by any means. There is a lot of creative ability able to be applied and used within this game and its build creation, and the game is obviously still pretty much as new as it can be as well, so I'm sure even more broken synergies will be found over time. But this is all the stuff that I wanted to share right now, just under a week into the release of Early Access. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.